When a cop spots a little girl wandering barefoot in the dead of night, he assumes she's just lost. But when he sees the teddy bear she's holding stained with blood, his blood runs cold. Calling for backup, he steps into a crime scene that will unravel a deadly conspiracy, a hidden past and a fight for justice, 3 years in the making. Before we dive into this story, let us know where you're watching from, and if you stand for justice, don't forget to like, subscribe, and stay tuned for more. The streets were dead. Officer Elliot Kane eased his patrol car down Maplewood Drive. The cruiser's headlights sweeping over parked cars and darkened houses, the glow of porch lights dotted a few lawns, but most homes had long since gone still. It was past 2 a.m., the quietest stretch of the night, the kind of stillness that either meant everyone was asleep or something was terribly wrong. He exhaled sharply, rolling his shoulders to shake off the creeping fatigue. It had been a long shift and he was already thinking about the coffee waiting back at the precinct. Just a quick stop, maybe sit for a minute before clocking out. Then movement. A small figure drifted into view beneath a flickering street lamp, barely noticeable at first. A child, barefoot and alone. Elliot's hands tightened on the wheel. His foot instinctively eased off the gas as his eyes locked onto the girl. She was young, no more than 5 or 6, and standing in the middle of the sidewalk wearing nothing but a thin nightgown, her hair dark and tangled, fell over her face. In one arm she clutched a teddy bear, its limp body dragging slightly toward the pavement. She wasn't running, she wasn't crying, she just stood there, his stomach twisted. This wasn't right. Elliot pulled over, threw the car into park, and stepped out. The night air was cool but heavy, a contrast to the warmth still clinging to the asphalt. He left the driver's side door open, the police radio crackling softly in the background as he approached the child. The girl didn't react to the sound of his boots on the pavement. Elliot kept his movements slow, measured. His training told him that kids who wander alone this late usually fall into 2 categories, scared or lost. This one neither. She wasn't scanning the area, wasn't searching for help. She just stood in place, gripping the stuffed animal like a lifeline. He crouched down a few feet away, keeping his voice soft. "Hey, sweetheart," he said. "Why?" "Okay. What are you doing out here all alone?" The girl's wide eyes flickered toward him but offered no answer. Her face was pale, her cheeks smudged with dirt, but it was her expression that unsettled him most. She wasn't crying. She wasn't afraid. Just vacant. A cold sensation crawled up his spine. Elliot glanced around, scanning the houses nearby. No movement. No porch lights flicking on. No sound of a frantic parent calling a child's name. No one was looking for her. His focus returned to her. He softened his tone. "What's your name?" Still nothing. Her arms tightened around the teddy bear, fingers curling into the fabric. She was shaking, not from the cold, but something. Deeper shock. Elliot's pulse kicked up. He glanced at her bare feet. They were dirty, slightly scraped, but nothing that suggested she'd walked far, which meant she had to be from one of the nearby houses. "Are you lost?" he tried again. No answer. He studied her for a second longer, then shifted slightly. "Can I see your bear this time?" She reacted. Her fingers twitched, gripping the stuffed animal even tighter, but then slowly, deliberately, she lifted it toward him. She wasn't just letting him see it, she was giving it to him. Elliot took it carefully. It was heavier than it should have been. The moment Elliot touched the bear, something felt wrong. The fur wasn't just dirty, it was stiff, matted. He lifted it closer, adjusting the angle beneath the street lamp. Blood. His throat went dry. Not just a smear, not a few spots. The teddy bear's fabric was stained. It wasn't fresh, but there was too much of it for a simple scrape or cut. Elliot's training kicked in. He immediately scanned the girl for injuries, checking her arms, her legs, anywhere she might be hurt. Nothing. She wasn't bleeding, so whose blood was on the bear? His jaw tensed. "Are you hurt?" The girl shook her head. Then why the hell was she alone? And why was she covered in someone else's blood? Elliot flipped the bear over, running his thumb across its belly. That's when he noticed the stitching. It looked off, not a manufacturer's seam. Hand-stitched, sloppily done. Someone had opened the bear up and sewn it shut again. A slow, creeping dread curled in his gut. This wasn't just a lost child. Something else was going on. He exhaled sharply, bringing the radio clip to his shoulder up to his mouth. He was about to call for backup when the girl finally spoke. Her voice was so quiet he almost missed it. "They're still in the house." Elliot's stomach dropped. The drive was short, but the weight in Elliot Kane's chest made it feel longer. The little girl sat in the back seat, eerily still, her hands curled around the teddy bear like a lifeline. She hadn't said another word since whispering. They're still in the house. She didn't ask where they were going, didn't look out the window, didn't make a sound. Most kids in her situation would be crying, shaking, asking for their parents, but not her. That wasn't right. None of this was right. Elliot's grip tightened on the steering wheel as he followed the girl's silent direction. Through the quiet neighborhood, it was a nice area. Manicured lawns. Tidy driveways, a place where people felt safe leaving their doors unlocked. The kind of street where nothing bad was ever supposed to happen. But something had happened. The house came into view, a two-story suburban home, porch light off, windows dark. It looked like every other house on the block except for one thing: the front door was slightly open. Elliot braked a few houses down, parking beneath a tree to keep his vehicle from being obvious. He killed the headlights in the rearview mirror. The girl didn't react, didn't seem to care that they'd stopped. He turned to her. "This, your house?" She didn't answer, just stared at the teddy bear. His stomach tightened. Reaching for his radio, he pressed the button. "This is Unit 7, requesting immediate backup, possible homicide scene at..." He rattled off the address, his voice steady but his pulse ticking up. The dispatcher confirmed his request. But he wasn't about to wait. If someone was still inside, if there was a chance anyone was still alive, he had to move now. He turned back to the girl. "Stay in the car." She didn't respond, didn't even look at him. That feeling in his gut, the one that had started when he found her on the sidewalk, deepened, hand on his holster. He stepped out into the night. The air was still, too still. Elliot approached the house cautiously, keeping his footsteps light on the pavement. The front yard was neat, not a blade of grass out of place, no signs of a struggle, no shattered windows, no blood on the porch. But the door being ajar was enough. He drew his weapon with his free hand. He nudged the door open. Further, the hinges let out a slow groaning creak. Darkness, silence. His flashlight cut through the gloom, sweeping over the entryway. Nothing looked immediately out of place. Shoes lined up near the door. A coat draped over a chair. A framed family photo on the wall. But then the smell hit him. Metallic, heavy, wrong blood. His jaw tightened. He moved deeper into the house, sweeping his light over the living room. Something had knocked over a lamp. Its shade cracked, bulb dark. A few picture frames had fallen, glass splintered on the hardwood floor. And then to his left, movement. Elliot spun, gun raised. But it wasn't a person. It was a ceiling fan lazily spinning overhead. He exhaled slowly. Keep moving past the living room. The hallway stretched into darkness to his right. An open archway led to the kitchen. That's when he saw her. A woman in her mid-30s, collapsed against the wall, legs sprawled, head slumped. Blood had pooled beneath her, soaking into the grout between the tiles. Her hand was curled toward her chest, fingers stiff. Her eyes, still open, stared at nothing. Elliot forced himself to breathe. He stepped closer, scanning the rest of the room. No sign of a struggle. No overturned chairs, no broken dishes, just the bee. Whoever did this hadn't been in a rush. They had taken their time. A noise creaked overhead, the floorboards above him. Elliot's gun came up immediately. Someone was upstairs. He wasn't alone. His heart was pounding now. He moved back into the hallway, gun raised, every nerve in his body on high alert. The stairs loomed ahead, a dark ascent into unknown danger. One step at a time. Slow, controlled. Floorboard creaked beneath his weight at the top of the stairs. A soft glow of light spilled from a doorway partially open. He moved toward it, breath steady, grip firm, and then he pushed the door open and stopped. A man in his 40s lay on his back near the foot of the bed. Gunshot wound to the chest. Blood had seeped into the carpet, dark and thick. His face was twisted, frozen. Mixed expression, eyes staring at the ceiling. A stuffed animal lay nearby, its small furry arms stained red. Elliot's breath came slow and deliberate, but his stomach was twisting. Then his light shifted, and he saw the bed, two smaller forms, a boy maybe 10 and a girl slightly younger, side by side. Still no signs of a struggle. Elliot swallowed hard, dragging a shaky hand down his face. He took a slow step back, forcing himself to think. Who were these people? And why was the little girl in his squad car the only one left alive? He turned abruptly, retracing his steps down the hall, down the stairs, out the door. The moment he stepped onto the porch, his eyes flicked toward the squad car. The girl was exactly where he left her, still clutching the teddy bear, still eerily silent. Elliot exhaled, trying to steady himself. Then, for the first time since finding her, a single thought surfaced in his mind. Why was she the only one left? And worse, who had she been hiding from? Elliot stands on the porch, staring at the girl in the squad car. The night is silent again, but the weight in his chest is heavier than ever. Backup is on the way, but for the first time in a long time, he doesn't want to wait. He needs answers now. What do you think happened in that house? Was the little girl connected to the victims, or is there more to the story? And most importantly, was she really the only one left? Drop your theories in the comments, give this video a like, and keep watching to find out. The crime scene had transformed in less than an hour. What had been a quiet suburban home was now a chaotic flood of flashing lights, crime scene tape, and forensic teams combing through every inch of the house. Uniformed officers stood at the perimeter, keeping back the small crowd of early risers who had woken up to police cruisers and body bags being wheeled out of their neighbor house. Elliot Kane stood on the front porch, watching as the coroner zipped up the last body bag. The weight in his chest didn't lift. If anything, it got heavier. He turned his head as a car door slammed behind him. Detective Mara Lawson strode up the driveway, her expression unreadable. She was in her early 40s, sharp-eyed, no nonsense, the kind of detective who had seen everything but never took anything for her. Granted, Elliot had worked with her before. She didn't waste time. "You just found her wandering?" Mara asked as she stopped next to him. He didn't have to ask who she meant. The little girl, the only survivor, was now sitting in the back of a patrol car, still silent, still clutching the bear. He exhaled. "Yeah, no shoes, no jacket, just walking." Mara frowned. She didn't say anything. Elliot shook his head. "Not until she handed me the bear at that." He lifted the teddy bear slightly. Mara's gaze locked onto the dark-eyed stains on the fur. She swore under her breath. The bear was immediately taken into evidence inside the forensic van, a tech named Brian Hole. He carefully examined it under bright white lights. His gloved fingers ran over the stitching, pausing as he reached a small lump beneath the fabric. "Something's inside," he muttered. He grabbed a scalpel, carefully slicing along the rough, uneven stitching. As soon as he peeled the fabric back, the mood in the van shifted. Holt's face went rigid. Inside the stuffing, wedged between layers of cotton, was a human fingernail, broken, embedded deep. Dried blood clung to the edges. Outside, the van stiffened. That wasn't an accident. Elliot felt something cold settle in his stomach. Whoever that fingernail had belonged to, they hadn't just touched the bear, they'd fought for their life. "Get this processed immediately," Mara ordered. "Run the blood. I want to know whose it is." Holt nodded. "Already sealing the evidence bag." Mara exhaled, rubbing her temple before glancing back toward the patrol car where the girl sat. She was still holding on to the bear, even though it wasn't there anymore. Like she didn't realize it was gone. Or like she didn't care. An hour later, the IDS came in. The bodies belonged to Darren and Melissa Renner, along with their 2 children, Ethan 10 and Sarah 8, a normal family. No criminal records, nothing to suggest why someone had wanted them dead. But the girl, no record of her. "She's not in the system," Mara said, flipping through the files. "No birth certificate, no medical records. As far as official documents go, she doesn't exist." Elliot frowned. "She told me her name was Lucy Renner. Doesn't mean she's theirs." A neighbor was brought in for questioning. A woman in her 60s, who had lived next door to the renters for over a decade. "Did you ever see this girl before?" Mara asked, sliding a photo across the table. The neighbor hesitated, glancing at the image of the girl sitting in the patrol car. "Not often," she admitted. "I mean, I saw her a couple of times peeking out of the upstairs window, but every time I waved she disappeared. I just assumed she was shy." Mara and Elliot exchanged a look. "How long ago was the first time you saw her?" Elliot pressed. The woman frowned, thinking, "Maybe 3 years?" Mara's expression darkened. 3 years? If Lucy wasn't biologically part of the Renner family, where had she come from back at the crime scene? Lucy was still eerily unresponsive until she picked up a notepad from the table. Elliot and Mara watched as she started drawing. Her small hands moved carefully, sketching straight lines, a square, a tiny rectangle inside it. "What is that?" Mara asked. Lucy didn't answer. Elliot leaned in. "Is this a door?" Lucy nodded. Mara and Elliot exchanged a glance. The sketch was simple but clear, a hidden door. Elliot looked back at the house. Unease growing minutes later. He was upstairs with 2 uniformed officers scanning the walls of the master bedroom. If Lucy had been hiding in this house, she had to have been somewhere then near the bookshelf. He saw it, a faint scratch along the baseboard, too uniform to be accidental. He pressed against the bookshelf and it moved with a low creak. The entire shelving unit swung outward, revealing a crawl space behind it. The air inside was stale, dust-filled but lived in. A thin mattress lay against the wall, along with old food wrappers and children's drawings taped up. Someone had been staying here. And it wasn't recent. Mara stepped beside him, her expression unreadable. She was hiding. Elliot's gaze dropped to the wooden beams above the mattress. There, scratched into the wood, were two initials. LG. A chill ran through him. Lucy Renner, he murmured. But even as he said it, something didn't feel right. Lucy had been hidden away for 3 years, but why? And if she wasn't really a Renner, who was she? The precinct was buzzing with activity, but inside the homicide division it was dead silent. Elliot Kane sat across from Detective Mara Lawson in one of the conference rooms. The evidence file spread between them. The fluorescent lights cast a harsh glow on the glossy crime scene photos and forensic reports. It had been hours since they found the crawl space, but the questions it raised still hung heavy in the air. Lucy had been hidden for 3 years. Someone had been keeping her there on purpose, and now everyone who might have known why was dead. Mara flipped through the latest forensic report, her fingers tapping against the page as she read the fingernail embedded in the stitching that didn't belong to anyone in the Renner family. Elliot's attention snapped back to her. Who does it belong to? Mara turned the page. Forensic match report unknown. Adult mammal. No immediate DNA match in the system. Elliot leaned back in his chair, processing. So, whoever's fingernail that is, they were in the house that night. They were close enough to be part of whatever happened. Mara nodded grimly, and close enough to the bear to leave a print. She slid another sheet forward, a single fingerprint clear as day, recovered from the teddy bear's fabric, and this time there was a hit in the database. Elliot skimmed the file. Daryl Scott, 39, career criminal, mostly home invasions, burglaries, a couple of assault charges. Mara was already pulling up his rap sheet on the precinct computer. Did a fine-year stint at Stanton Correctional, got out on parole 6 months ago. Then nothing. No job, no registered address, not a damn trace. Elliot rubbed his jaw. So either he's laying low or he's dead. Mara leaned back, arms crossed. Guess we better find out. Daryl Scott had done a hell of a job staying off the radar. No recent arrests, no known employment, no credit card transactions. The guy had gone dark. But criminals like Scott didn't just disappear. Not unless someone made them disappear, Elliot. Mara spent the next 2 hours digging into his known associates' old arrest records and any recent addresses he might have used. Then a break. Mara's fingers drummed against the desk as she found a 6-month-old parole record. Got something. His last known address was a trailer park just outside city limits. Elliot checked the listing. It wasn't much. A rundown mobile home on a patch of land with no listed owner. Mara grabbed her coat. Let's go. The drive took them nearly 40 minutes as they turned onto a narrow pothole-riddled road. The houses thinned out, replaced by rusted trailers, sagging porches and cars that looked abandoned more than parked. Most of the street lights were out, leaving the whole place blanketed in shadows. The kind of place people disappeared without anyone noticing. Mara pulled the car to a stop a few yards from Scott's trailer. The place was dark, silent. A beat-up sedan sat in the driveway, but there was no sign of movement. Elliot glanced at Mara. No lights, no dogs barking. This feel off to you? Feels like we're already too late, she muttered, hand resting near her holstered weapon. Elliot stepped out, first boots crunching on gravel. The air was thick, and still the closer he got to the trailer, the stronger the feeling in his gut that something was very, very wrong. Mara followed, covering the rear as they approached the front steps. The door was open, not wide, just enough to be noticeable. Mara exhaled sharply. That's never a good sign. Elliot tested the knob. Unlocked. He exchanged a glance with Mara, nodded, and pushed the door open the rest of the way. The first thing that hit them was the smell. Metallic, stale, wrong blood. Elliot's grip on his weapon tightened. The interior was dark, lit only by the bluish flicker of a TV screen playing static. A quick scan showed the place was a mess. Empty beer cans, cigarette butts, old food containers, and then movement. Mara swung her flashlight toward the couch, gun raised, but no one was there, just a blanket draped over the cushions. A cigarette still burning in an ashtray someone left in a hurry, she muttered. Elliot moved deeper inside. His pulse was steady, but that uneasy weight in his chest was growing. Then he saw the feet, a pair of bare, unmoving feet sticking out from behind the kitchen counter. His stomach clenched. He knew what he was about to see before he even stepped closer. Daryl Scott lay sprawled on the floor, no hesitation, no struggle. Blood had pooled beneath him, long since dried. Mara exhaled slowly. Well, that explains why he dropped off the radar. Elliot stared down at the body, jaw tight. Someone got to him first. And if they had, it meant they were tying up loose ends the same way they had with the Rainers. Elliot looked around the dimly lit trailer, every nerve on edge. The place was silent, but the way the cigarette still smoldered in the ashtray, the way the static on the TV hummed in the background. Whoever did this had been here. And they might not be far. Daryl Scott was dead, but the case still wasn't adding up. Elliot Kane sat at his desk in the precinct, staring at his monitor. The screen displayed everything they had so far. Crime scene photos, forensic reports, statements from neighbors, but none of it explained why a 6-year-old girl had been hidden for 3 years or why her entire foster family had been slaughtered. Lucy Renner wasn't in the system. No medical records, no school enrollment, no trace of her existing before she appeared in that house. That was impossible. So Elliot dug deeper. He ran a broader search, checking missing cases from 3 years ago, expanding the parameters. Took time, but then a match. Lena Grayson. Elliot straightened the case file, loaded, showing a woman and her 5-year-old daughter who had vanished 3 years ago. The details were vague. Lena had been married to a federal prosecutor, Daniel Grayson, according to the report. Daniel had been working a major case targeting multiple high-level figures, but before he could bring anything to trial, he was murdered. Official cause of death: a robbery gone wrong. Elliot's jaw tightened. The timeline fit. Daniel Grayson was killed, his wife and daughter disappeared, and 3 years later the daughter reappears in a house full of dead bodies. Lena hadn't vanished. She had run, and if she had been hiding Lucy, that meant Lucy wasn't just some lost child. She was the key to something bigger. Daryl Scott had been a lot of things: a thief, a repeat offender, a man who operated on the fringes of the law, but one thing was certain: he hadn't seen it coming. The next step was obvious: follow the money. Scott had been a small-time crook. Guys like him didn't end up dead for no reason, and they sure as hell didn't have the resources to orchestrate a targeted home invasion and multiple homicides. Mara and Elliot sat in the precinct cyber division, watching as a forensic analyst pulled up Scott's financials. Most of his bank activity was what they expected: withdrawals from ATMs, minor purchases at liquor stores and gas stations, the kind of spending habits of a man who lived paycheck to paycheck, except his paychecks came from whatever he could steal. Then something stood out. The day before he died, a $25,000 deposit was made into his account. Elliot's eyes narrowed. That's not a typical payday for a burglar. Mara leaned forward. Where did it come from? The analyst clicked a few keys, tracing the origin of the transfer. Looks like an offshore account. More keystrokes, a pause, then linked to a private security firm. Mara's expression darkened. You don't make deposits like that for a home invasion. Elliot's stomach twisted. That's a hit. Silence settled between them. Whoever had hired Scott wasn't just after the renters. They had cleaned him up the second he became a live liability. Mara's voice was low. Someone paid him to kill that family, but they didn't want him alive afterward. Elliot stared at the numbers on the screen. That meant they were dealing with professionals. People who weren't just willing to kill but knew exactly how to make people disappear. Then, Elliot pulled up Scott's phone records. A single text message stood out. It had come in just minutes before he was murdered. The sender was untraceable, the number already wiped. But the words were clear: you should have killed the girl too. Elliot and Mara exchanged a look. Whoever sent this text, they weren't finished. The numbers didn't lie. Elliot Kinane sat in front of his computer screen, staring at the transaction logs for Daryl Scott's bank account. The $25,000 payment had been wired in the day before Scott was killed. It had come from an offshore account, routed through multiple shell companies. The kind of financial maneuvering that only serious players use to stay hidden. But what stood out the most: the money. LED back to a private security firm, Blackthorn Solutions. Mara Lawson sat beside him. Scanning her own screen, she clicked through the firm's public records, what little was available. Blackthorn's got contracts with defense contractors, government agencies, corporate executives. Officially, they provide protection services. Elliot didn't buy it. That's a lot of money for a bodyguard service. Mara frowned. They don't just guard people, they fix problems. She turned the screen toward him. Reports flashed across the display. Allegations, accusations. But no convictions. They've been tied to black ops work, off the books government contracts. Whenever someone needs a problem to disappear, Blackthorn is the company they call. Elliot rubbed his jaw. And someone called them to take out the renters. Mara nodded. Which means whoever is behind this isn't just rich. They have power. That was what bothered Elliot the most. A small-time criminal like Daryl Scott didn't get hired by high-level enforcers like Blackthorn. That meant Scott was just a tool. And the real players still out there, they needed more than just bank records. They needed name. Mara made a call. 20 minutes later, they were sitting in a diner across from Devon Marks, an FBI analyst who owed Mara a favor. He was in his early 40s, wore thick glasses, and had the nervous energy of someone who had seen things he wished he hadn't. Marks stirred his coffee, glancing around like he expected someone to be listening. "You're playing with fire asking about Blackthorn." Elliot leaned in. "We're looking into a murder. A family was wiped out. 2 parents, 2 kids. The guy who pulled the trigger was paid by Blackthorn, who ordered the hit." Marks hesitated. "That's the problem. Blackthorn doesn't operate like a normal firm. They don't just take contracts from anyone. They only work for people in power." Mara's jaw tightened, meaning Marks sighed, meaning if Blackthorn was involved, whoever ordered the hit has serious connections. Someone high enough up the chain that they don't have to worry about accountability. Elliot exchanged a glance with Mara. "And if they paid Scott to kill the Reners?" Marks tapped his fingers against the table. "Then someone big wanted them dead." Mara leaned forward. "You have anything on them?" Marks hesitated. Then, with a reluctant sigh, he reached into his bag and pulled out a sealed FBI file. "Blackthorn has been on our radar for a while," he admitted. "We flagged several homicides with their fingerprints all over them, but nothing sticks. The people who hire them, they don't leave trails." He slid the file across the table. "Take a look." Elliot opened the file, flipping through the first few pages. Case after case, families wiped out, no survivors, and all of them had one common thread. They weren't random. Mara skimmed a report, muttering under her breath. These people weren't just victims, they were threats. Elliot frowned. Threats? How? Morris took a sip of his coffee. "Look closer." Elliot turned the page, and that's when he saw it. Each victim had been tied to a larger investigation: government corruption, corporate fraud, criminal cases involving high-level officials. Mara exhaled sharply. "Whistleblowers," Marks nodded. "Blackthorn doesn't just do hits, they clean up messes." Elliot flipped to the last page. His breath caught. A name stood out among the past cases. Lena Grayson. His tongue dropped. Mara saw it too. She was on their list. Elliot swallowed his mind. Lena Grayson disappeared 3 years ago, and now they knew why she hadn't just run. Someone had tried to kill her. Elliot closed the file, his pulse pounded in his ears. Lucy's mother had been a target. That meant whoever had ordered the Renner deaths wasn't finished. Lena Grayson had been missing for 3 years, but she wasn't dead. Elliot Kane sat in the passenger seat of Mara Lawson's unmarked police car, scanning the files on his laptop. Outside, the city blurred past in a haze of streetlights and early morning mist. Neither of them had slept, neither of them planned to. Blackthorn's solutions had been cleaning up loose ends. First the Reners, then Daryl Scott. And now they knew why Len had been on their list, which meant she was still alive. Mara, gripping the wheel, flicked a glance at GL at him. "You sure about this, Elliot?" Didn't look up. "Blackthorn wouldn't be tying up loose ends if she was dead," she nodded, lips pressed into a thin line. "Then let's find her before they do." They had spent the past 3 hours digging into anything Lena might have left behind. Old bank accounts, utility bills, cell tower pings. She had gone off the grid, but not perfectly. Finally, Mara hit on something here. She slid her phone across the console. On the screen was a rural property listing, purchased in cash 2 years ago under an alias. No utilities, no public record of a resident. It was deep in the mountains, miles from the nearest town, remote, isolated, the kind of place someone went to disappear. Elliot exhaled. "That's her." Mara turned off the highway. Time to bring Lena Grayson back. The road was barely a road. Mara's car jolted over gravel and uneven dirt, trees towering on either side. The safe house came into view through the fog, a small cabin, dark and silent. No car outside, no movement. Elliot stepped out first, gun drawn. The air smelled damp, pine heavy. It was too quiet. Mara followed, scanning the perimeter. Looks deserted. Elliot moved to the front door. He tried the knob. Locked. He glanced at Mara, then stepped back and kicked the door open inside. It was dim, the air was stale but not abandoned. His flashlight swept across the space. A thin mattress in the corner, a few canned goods on a shelf, a burner phone charging on the counter. Then on the wooden table, something caught his eye. A child's drawing. It was simple. A woman and a little girl holding hands. Scrawled underneath in uneven handwriting, "Mommy and me." Elliot's grip on his gun tightened. Lena had been here recently. Mara checked the counter, running a hand over the dust. This isn't old. She was right. The burner phone was still charging. Then the hair on the back of Elliot's neck stood up. Something was wrong. A click from outside. Then gunfire. Bullets tore through the wooden walls, shattering glass down. Elliot grabbed Mara and yanked her behind the overturned table. The front door burst open. 3 men in clothing and masks stormed in, weapons raised. "Blackthorn," Elliot fired first 2 shots. One man staggered back, hitting the floor. Mara took out the second. The third moved fast, firing as he dove. Behind the couch, Elliot ducked, heart hammering. These weren't amateurs. Mara gritted her teeth. "They knew we'd come," Elliot reloaded. "Then we finished this." The masked man peeked over the couch and was immediately blasted off his feet, not by Elliot, not by Mara, but by a shotgun blast from the shadows. The remaining attacker crashed into the wall, dead before he hit the ground. Silence. Elliot turned, gun still raised. A woman stepped forward, shotgun still smoking. She was tall, lean, her face hard with exhaustion and fury. Her eyes locked onto Elliot and Mara, but she wasn't looking at them. She was looking past them at the child drawing on the table. Mara lowered her gun slowly. "Lena Grayson." Lena's grip on the shotgun tightened. Her voice was hoarse. "Where's my daughter?" Elliot held up the teddy bear. "She survived, but we need answers now." The interrogation room was cold. Lena Grayson sat in the metal chair, arms folded, staring at the two-way mirror. Her face was set, hardened by 3 years of running, hiding, and losing everything. Elliot stood on the other side of the table across from her. Mara Lawson leaned against the wall, arms crossed, watching for the past hour. Lena had refused to say anything, but that changed when Elliot placed the teddy bear on the table between them. Lena's gaze flickered to it. Her jaw clenched, her fingers twitched just slightly before she forced herself to stay still. "You've been running for 3 years. Elliot said. "We need to know why." Lena exhaled sharply. "You already know why." "We know your husband was murdered," Mara said. "We know. He was investigating high-level corruption before he died. What we don't know is why Lucy was hidden with the Rainers. Why they were murdered." Lena's shoulders tensed because she wasn't safe with me. Elliot leaned forward. "Safe from who?" Lena finally looked up, and in her eyes, Elliot saw something raw, anger, grief, and something close to fear. "The same people who killed my husband," she said. She glanced at the bear again. Her voice was quieter this time. "And they never stopped looking for her." Elliot had spent his career picking apart lies. Lena wasn't lying, but she wasn't telling them everything either. "You left Lucy with the Rainers," Elliot said. "Why them?" Lena rubbed her hand over her face, silent for a long moment. Then finally she spoke. "Daniel was a federal prosecutor. She said he was building a case against powerful people. I didn't know everything, but I knew enough." She exhaled, staring at the table. "Then one night he called me from his office, told me he had the final piece of evidence he needed." She swallowed. "That was the last time I ever heard his voice." Elliot's jaw tightened. He already knew how this part ended. "They called it a robbery," she said bitterly. They killed him for what he knew." Mara nodded. "So, you ran?" Lena let out a short, humorless laugh. "I ran because I had no choice." She looked up at them, eyes sharp. "Lucy saw it." Elliot stilled, saw what Lena's voice was firm. "The night Daniel was murdered, Lucy was there. She saw his killers." The room went silent. "She was supposed to be asleep," Lena said, her voice quieter now. "But she heard something. She came to downstairs and she saw them." Elliot didn't move. He could see it in his mind, a 3-year-old girl frozen in the dark, watching as her father was executed. Lena's hands curled into fists. She was too young to understand what was happening, but they saw her, and they knew she'd remember. Mara's face was unreadable. "So they came after you next?" Lena nodded. "I grabbed Lucy and ran. I didn't stop." She exhaled. "But I couldn't keep her safe forever, no matter where we went. They were always close behind. I had to find somewhere they wouldn't look." Elliot glanced at the crime scene photos pinned to the caseboard. "The Renner family, you trusted them," he said. Lena's voice was horror. Melissa Renner was my best friend. She was the only person I could trust. Tears welled in her eyes, but she held them back. I had to give her up to save her. Mara's expression softened just a little. You thought Lucy would be safer if no one knew she existed? Lena nodded. I changed her name. I told the Renners to never tell anyone. Where she came from, Elliot exhaled slowly. It made sense, the reason no one in the neighborhood knew about Lucy. The reason she had been hidden. But now the Renners were dead, and whoever had been looking for Lucy had finally found her. The safe house was quiet. Lena sat at the edge of the worn-out couch, her hands clasped together, shoulders tense. Across from her, Elliot Kane and Mara Lawson worked at the small wooden table. Files and evidence spread between them. The room was dimly lit, the weight of the past 3 years pressing down on all of them. They had been going in circles, retracing the same events over and over. The Renners were dead. Blackthorne had orchestrated the hit. Daryl Scott had been silenced, and Lena had spent years running trying to keep her daughter safe. But they were still missing something. Elliot exhaled and picked up the teddy bear. It had been with Lucy since the night he found her. He wondered if it had other secrets hidden within. He turned it over in his hands, staring at the frayed edges, the uneven stitching on its belly. Then his gut told him something was off. He ran his fingers over the seams, pressing into the fabric. The stuffing inside felt different. Mara caught the change in his expression. What is it? Elliot grabbed a pocket knife and carefully sliced along the stitching as he peeled the fabric apart. Something small and solid tumbled onto the table. A memory card. Lena sucked in a sharp breath. No, Elliot. Mara exchanged a look before turning back to her. You knew about this? Elliot asked. Lena's hands were trembling. Not at first, she whispered. But after we ran, after I realized people were still coming for us, I suspected. Elliot frowned. Start from the beginning. How did this get inside Lucy's bear? Lena hesitated, then finally met his eyes. Because my husband put it there. Lena rubbed her hands together, staring at the memory card like it might burn her. Daniel knew he was being watched, she said. He was working on the biggest case of his career, corruption, bribery, high-level government figures. He told me he had enough to end careers. Elliot inserted the memory card into Mara's laptop. A single audio file appeared. Mara clicked play, static, then voices. 2 men, one was calm and control. The other was hesitant. Then clear as day, Gerald Vance, you don't get to have second thoughts about this. You took the money. That means you're in the second. Voice was lower, nervous. I didn't sign up for executions. Vance let out a short laugh. You think this is about one man? We're talking billions in contracts. You don't get cold feet now. There was a pause. Then the second man spoke again. And grace in a beat of silence, then Vance's voice, quieter but firm. His case disappears. He disappears. Lena's breath hitched. Elliot's grip on the table tightened. This was the kill order. This wasn't about the Renner family. This was about why Daniel had been murdered. The static crackled again, and the second voice asked, his wife. She'll run, Vance replied, but we'll find her. The recording ended. Mara leaned back, stunned. Elliot exhaled slowly. His mind was racing. This was the proof Daniel had died for. But it wasn't enough. Vance was powerful. This recording alone wouldn't take him down. Not when he had ACS influence people willing to cover for him. Mara's expression hardened. We need more, Elliot nodded. We need him to expose himself. Vance still believed Lucy was just a loose end. That was their advantage. We make him think Lucy remembers everything, Elliot said. Mara nodded, already catching on. We make it look like she's going to testify. Lena's hands clenched. That's a death sentence. Elliot met her gaze. Not if we control how it happens. Mara was already running scenarios. We leaked the right information, make it sound like Lucy told us what she saw. Lena swallowed, and when he comes after her, Elliot's voice was cold. We end it. Lucy had been silent the entire time, curled in the corner of the couch, holding the now empty bear. Then she spoke. Her voice was small but steady. I remember more than they think. Elliot glanced at her. She wasn't afraid. She was ready. The storm had been building for 3 years now. It was about to break. Elliot Kane sat in the front seat of an unmarked SUV, his hands gripping the steering wheel, his eyes locked on the small house across the street. The safe house. Except it wasn't safe at all. It was a decoy. A carefully staged setup inside. Lena and Lucy Grayson were waiting to any outsider. It looked like they had gone into protective custody, relocated to a quiet suburban home under police guard. But the truth was the house had been wired for surveillance. Every movement, every sound was monitored. SWAT units were stationed nearby, agents hidden in the darkness waiting. And Elliot, he was waiting too. Mara Lawson sat beside him, her gun resting on her thigh, her face tense in the dim light. You think he's really going to show? Elliot exhaled slowly. He's got no choice. Vance had spent 3 years tying up loose ends. The Reiners, Daryl Scott, anyone who could connect him to the murder of Daniel Grayson and the corruption case that had nearly exposed him. And now he thought Lucy was the last one left. The bait had been set. Word had spread that Lucy was talking, that she remembered, and now they just had to wait. Then headlights appeared down the street. Elliot's body tensed. Here we go. A black SUV pulled up outside the house. The engine cut off, the doors opened, and 4 men stepped out, dressed in dark tactical gear, weapons in hand. And then Gerald Vance emerged. Mara swore under her breath. He came personally. Elliot's jaw tightened. He's desperate. He reached for his radio. All units stand by. The tension in the air thickened. Vance gestured toward the house, and his men moved in. They were seconds away from walking into a trap. Elliot's radio crackled. Suspects are moving. He barely had time to process before all hell broke loose. The instant the first gunman reached the front door, a flashbang detonated. The explosion of light and sound stunned the intruders, throwing them off balance. Then SWAT and FBI agents swarmed from the shadows. Gunfire erupted. Elliot and Mara were already out of the SUV, weapons raised. The first gunman went down before he could even fire another. Tried to retreat, but a well-placed shot from a sniper took him out. Vance turned to run. Elliot saw it happening in slow motion, the panic in his eyes, the realization that he had lost. He bolted toward his SUV, trying to escape. Elliot tackled him before he could make it. They hit the ground hard, gravel scraping against Elliot's skin. He twisted, pinning Vance down, his knee pressing into his back. Vance struggled, but Elliot was stronger. He yanked Vance's arms behind his back, pulling out his cuffs. Vance let out a ragged breath and let out a low, humorless chuckle. You don't understand the people I work for, he sneered. Elliot pressed the barrel of his gun to the back of Vance's skull. And you don't understand what happens when you mess with a kid. Red and blue lights flashed across the neighborhood. Vance's men were either dead or in custody. SWAT officers moved through the house, confirming that Lena and Lucy were unharmed. Vance himself was restrained, hands cuffed behind his back, still smirking as Elliot pushed him against a police car. You really think this changes anything? Vance muttered. No one's coming for you, Mara cut in coldly. You're done. Elliot stared at him, eyes burning. For 3 years this men had killed, covered up, and destroyed lives. Now it was over. But then Vance's gaze shifted. He wasn't looking at Elliot anymore. He was looking at Lucy. She had stepped out of the safe house clutching the teddy bear. Vance's lips curled into a smirk. It's almost funny, he said. That kid won't even remember what happened. Something in Lucy's mind snapped. Her fingers tightened around the bear. Her breath hitched. She did remember. A warm living room, the soft glow of a lamp, a man's voice on the phone, low, tense. Daniel Grayson, I have proof. It's Vance. I have everything I need. A knock at the door. Daniel stiffened. His eyes flicked to the front window, headlights. Then he turned to his daughter. Go upstairs, sweetheart, now. Lucy didn't move. The door burst open and 2 men entered. Gunfire, blood. Her father fell. Lucy clamped a hand over her mouth, trembling. One of the men hesitated. What about the kid? Then a third figure stepped inside. Tall, dark suit, cold eyes. Cold eyes, Gerald Vance. His voice was flat, emotionless. No, loose ends. Lucy looked up and saw him staring right at her. Lucy gasped, her body shaking. She looked up at Vance, and for the first time her voice was strong. You killed my father. Vance's smirk faded. The color drained from his face. Elliot's grip on his cuffs tightened. The past wasn't buried. And Vance was finally going to pay. The courtroom was suffocating with tension. Reporters filled the back rows, cameras ready to capture the moment that had been 3 years in the making. Law enforcement officers lined the walls, their presence a silent reminder of the weight of this case. Government officials sat stiffly, some watching in interest, others looking like they wished they were anywhere else at the defense table. Gerald Vance sat motionless, smirking. Elliot Kane, seated near the front, watched him closely. Vance had spent years manipulating the system, making people disappear, covering up his crimes with power and money. He had walked away from everything before, but this time he wasn't walking away. Vance's smirk faltered when the doors opened, and Lucy Grayson was inside. She was small, just 6 years old, her frame almost lost in the oversized chair at the witness stand. But her posture was steady. Her grip on the teddy bear was tight, but her hands weren't shaking. Elliot exhaled. She was ready. The judge adjusted his glasses and turned toward the defense table. "Counselor, you may proceed." Vance's lead attorney, a sharp-dressed man with the kind of smug confidence that came from winning too many cases for the wrong people, rose from his seat and approached the stand. He barely glanced at Lucy before speaking. "Miss Grayson, you were 3 years old when your father was murdered." He clasped his hands behind his back, voice calm but patronizing. "You expect this court to believe you remember anything from that night?" Whispers rippled through the spectators. Elliot tensed, ready to intervene if needed. But Lucy didn't hesitate. She lifted her gaze directly at Vance. Her voice was clear, unwavering. "I remember exactly what he said." The room fell silent. Lucy's small fingers curled around the bear's fabric. She inhaled steady and then spoke again. "No loose ends." The words hung in the air like a loaded gun. A wave of murmurs swept through the courtroom. A juror leaned forward. One of the reporters frantically scribbled on a notepad. The judge gabbled the room back to order, but the shift had already happened for the first time since his arrest. Vance tensed. His smirk was gone. His fingers clenched against the table. Elliot watched him crack. The jury only took 4 hours to deliberate. Elliot sat in the front row, hands clasped. As the foreman stood to deliver the decision, the judge cleared his throat. "Has the jury reached a verdict?" "We have, Your Honor." The air in the courtroom thickened. The foreman lifted the slip of paper, unfolding it carefully before reading aloud. "On the charge of conspiracy to commit murder. Guilty on the charge of first-degree murder. Guilty on the charge of ordering the execution of the Renner family. Guilty." The courtroom erupted. Reporters rushed to document the moment. Cameras flashing. A cheer broke out from the victims' families, from law enforcement officers who had spent years trying to bring him down. Elliot barely heard any of it. His eyes were on Vance, the man who had spent his life above the law, who had laughed in faces of his victims, who had smirked at every proceeding, was now sitting stone-faced, his jaw clenched tight. Because, for the first time, there was no escape. The judge's voice cut through the noise. "General Vance, you are sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole." This time, Vance didn't smile, and Elliot let out a slow breath. It was over. Lena Grayson knelt in front of her daughter, tears brimming in her eyes. They were outside the courthouse, away from the cameras, away from the chaos. It had been 3 years of fear-loss running. Now it was finally over. Lena swallowed hard, brushing a strand of hair from Lucy's face. "I thought I lost you," she whispered. Lucy didn't hesitate. She wrapped her arms around her mother, holding tight. "You found me," she murmured against her shoulder. Lena choked back a sob, pressing a kiss to the top of Lucy's head. It wasn't just a reunion. It was a new beginning. Months later, Elliot pulled his car into the quiet suburban street, the warm glow of a porch light illuminating Lena and Lucy's new home. A normal house, a normal street, a normal life. Exactly what they deserved. Lucy was in the yard laughing, running in circles as she chased a fluttering butterfly. There was no fear in her eyes anymore, no hesitation in her movements, just a child finally allowed to be a child. She spotted Elliot and ran to him, her hair bouncing with each step. In her hands was the teddy bear. She stopped in front of him, holding it out. "You should keep him." Elliot raised an eyebrow. "Why?" Lucy smiled. "He kept me safe." Elliot hesitated, then slowly took the bear. The fabric was worn, but it felt heavier in his hands than it ever had before. Lucy beamed at him one last time, then ran back to Lena, who stood watching from the porch. She waved gratefully at Elliot before ushering Lucy inside. Elliot lingered for a moment, standing by his car, watching the front door close. He glanced down at the bear, exhaling softly, and then with a small smirk he murmured, "Stay safe, kid." He climbed into his car, started the engine, and drove away, knowing she finally would. Thanks for watching till the end. If you enjoyed this story, give this video a like if you haven't already, and subscribe for more.